Hey, welcome back, friend. I am really glad you're here with me tonight. So let me ask you something. What if I told you that for most of human history, the kindest thing society did for people who were suffering mentally was absolutely nothing? Or worse, that the things society did do were so horrifying. The word treatment almost feels like a cruel joke, because here is the thing. Before the asylums were built, before those enormous Gothic stone buildings rose up on the hillsides of England and America, there was something far darker waiting in their place. And understanding what came before those walls is the only way to truly understand what happened inside them. Tonight we're going back, before the locked wards, before the straitjackets, before all of it. We're going back to a world where the mentally ill were chained in cellars, abandoned in the streets, or locked away in back rooms by their own families, hidden from the world, like a secret too shameful to speak aloud. And by the end of this story, I think you will feel something you did not expect to feel. Not just shock and not just sadness, but something that feels almost like gratitude mixed with grief. Because the people who built the first asylums, they genuinely believed they were building something beautiful. Now, before we go any further, if this kind of storytelling is your thing, if you love history told slowly and gently with real heart behind it, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. And hey, I am curious, where are you listening from right now? Are you in bed already? Lights off, maybe a fan humming in the background? Drop it in the comments. I love picturing all the different corners of the world you're coming from. Okay, fan on, lights low. Let us begin. Let us go all the way back. Not to Victorian England, not yet. Let us go back even further to the world that existed before anyone ever thought to build a dedicated place for the mentally ill. For most of recorded human history, we're talking thousands of years, mental illness was not understood as an illness at all. It was understood as something else entirely. Possession, punishment from God, a curse, a sign of moral failure. Ancient civilizations drilled holes in skulls, a practice called trepanation, in the belief that cutting a hole in the bone would let the evil spirit out. Some of the oldest skulls ever found dating back 35,000 years show signs of this procedure. And the really unsettling part, some of those skulls show evidence of healing, meaning people survived it. Whether it helped them is another question entirely. In medieval Europe, the approach was not much gentler. People experiencing what we would now recognize as schizophrenia, severe depression or bipolar disorder were brought before the church. Exorcisms were performed. Priests prayed over trembling, terrified human beings who had no framework to understand what was happening to their own minds. And when the prayers did not work, and they rarely did, those people were beaten, starved, drowned in ice-cold water because someone had decided that shocking the body might somehow shock the soul back into order. And if none of that worked, the options got even grimmer. Families, especially wealthy ones, had a few choices. They could keep their disturbed relative locked in a back room of the house, which many did. They could send them to wander the roads as vagrants. Or if they had enough money, they could pay someone else to deal with the problem. This is where the madhouses come in, and I want you to understand these were not hospitals. They were businesses, private homes run by private individuals who took money from families in exchange for housing, and sometimes hiding their troubled relatives. By the early 1700s, these madhouses had spread across England like a quiet, profitable trade. Some were run by physicians. Many were not run by anyone with any medical training at all. And what did kept quiet looked like chains, iron shackles bolted to walls, patients left in their own filth for days at a time. One parliamentary investigation in 1763 uncovered a private madhouse in London where a man named William Norris had been chained to a wall for 12 years. 12 years. He had an iron bar locked around his neck attached to a chain short enough that he could neither stand fully upright nor lie down flat. When the inspectors finally found him, he was emaciated, pale as paper, and still entirely coherent. He could hold a conversation. He could tell them calmly and clearly exactly what had been done to him. The investigation caused a public outcry for about a week, and then the world moved on because there was simply no system in place to do anything differently. But here is something I find both fascinating and a little heartbreaking. Even in this era of genuine cruelty, there were people who knew better. Scattered across Europe quietly without fanfare, a few individuals were running small radical experiments in human compassion. In France, a physician named Philippe Pinel became director of the Bicêtre Asylum in Paris in 1793. One of his first acts was to walk into the courtyard where patients were kept in chains and order those chains removed. His colleagues thought he had lost his mind. His superiors warned him he would be killed. Instead, something unexpected happened. The patients, many of whom had been violent and unpredictable, became calmer, not all of them, and not immediately. But enough that Pinel took notice. He began keeping careful records. He talked to his patients like human beings. He asked them about their lives, their fears, their histories. He was not just observing symptoms, he was listening to people. Around the same time, on the other side of the English Channel, a quiet Quaker tea merchant in York was about to change everything. His name was William Tuke, and in 1790 a fellow Quaker woman named Hannah Mills was admitted to the York Asylum, a public institution that was by all accounts a brutal place. Her family asked to visit her. The asylum refused. A few weeks later, Hannah Mills was dead. William Tuke was devastated, and he was furious. He went to the local Quaker community and said, essentially, we need to build something better, a place where people are treated with dignity, where no one is chained, where no one is beaten, where human beings in distress are cared for the way you would care for a friend. In 1796, the retreat opened outside York. It could house about 30 patients. There were no chains, no shackles, no iron rings in the walls. Patients ate meals together at a table. They were expected to make conversation, to do small chores, to walk the grounds. The philosophy was radical for its time, and almost embarrassingly simple. Treat people as rational human beings capable of improving, and they often will. The results were astonishing. Recovery rates at the retreat were significantly higher than anything being reported from the chain and cold water institutions. Word spread. Reformers took notice. Visitors came from across Europe to observe this strange little experiment in human kindness. And it worked, which created a new problem. A beautiful, well-intentioned, ultimately disastrous problem. Because if a small, carefully tended institution with 30 patients could produce results like these, then surely a much larger institution serving hundreds of patients could do the same thing. Right. That was the logic behind the Great Victorian Asylum building project. In 1808, Britain passed the County Asylums Act. By 1845, the Lunacy Act made it mandatory. Every county in England had to have one. And so the building began. Enormous, architecturally ambitious institutions rose across the British countryside with farms attached so patients could work outdoors, chapels and dining halls and wide, airy corridors. Some of them were genuinely beautiful buildings. The architects who designed them believed that light and space and order could reach into a troubled mind and gently set it right. The people who built these places were not monsters. That is the part that gets lost in the history. They were optimists. They were in many cases genuinely compassionate human beings who looked at the madhouses and the chains and said no more. We can do better than this. And for a brief golden window of time, roughly the 1830s through the early 1850s, they were right. Recovery rates were cited with pride. Visiting inspectors wrote glowing reports. But then something happened. Something slow and inevitable and very, very hard to stop. People kept coming, more and more of them year after year. The poor, the desperate, the families who had nowhere else to turn. And the asylums built with the best intentions for a manageable number of patients began to fill and fill and fill. The dream of the asylum was born in the purest kind of hope. What happened next is where the story gets complicated and darker than most people realize, because behind those grand stone walls a world was quietly forming, a world with its own rules, its own language, its own hierarchy of power, a world where the line between patient and prisoner could blur until it disappeared entirely. And in the next part of our journey we're going to step through the gates of one of the most infamous asylums in human history, a place that started in the year 1247 and became so synonymous with madness that its very name entered the English language as a word for chaos itself. Its name was Bethlem, and what happened inside those walls will stay with you. Bethlem. Just say that word out loud for a moment. Bethlem. Even the sound of it has something uneasy in it, something that catches in the throat. We know it today by its shortened name Bedlam, and that word Bedlam has been in the English language for so long that most people have completely forgotten where it came from. We use it casually. It was absolute bedlam in there. The office was pure bedlam today. We say it to describe traffic jams and crowded airports and chaotic dinner parties. We have turned it into a joke, but it was not always a joke. It was a place with real walls, real corridors, real human beings living inside it. And its full name was the Bethlem Royal Hospital, founded in the year 1247 in the City of London, making it one of the oldest psychiatric institutions in the entire world. Nearly 800 years old. Let that land for a moment. Now I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further. When we talk about Bethlem, we're not talking about one fixed, unchanging nightmare. The institution evolved over centuries, sometimes dramatically. There were periods of genuine horror. There were also later genuine attempts at reform. I think history does us a disservice when it flattens complicated places into simple villains. So tonight I want to give you the full picture. The dark, the complicated, and the surprisingly human. But let us start at the beginning, because the beginning is stranger than you might expect. Bethlem did not start as an asylum at all. It started as a priory, a religious house established by a man named Simon Fitzmary, a wealthy citizen of London who donated land for a spiritual community dedicated to the Order of the Star of Bethlehem, hence the name. For the first 100 years of its existence, it was essentially a place for travelling clergy to rest, a guest house with a chapel, nothing remotely sinister about it. The first recorded mention of mentally ill patients at Bethlem comes from the year 1357. A royal survey noted that the priory was housing 6 men deprived of reason. 6. That was the whole population. And even then the records suggest they were simply being housed, given shelter, and food not really treated in any medical sense because the concept of psychiatric treatment did not yet exist. So how did this quiet little religious house become the most notorious institution in human history slowly? The way most terrible things happen slowly through a series of small decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time. By the 1500s, Bethlem had come under the management of the City of London. The church had lost its grip on it, which meant it needed secular funding. And secular funding meant the institution needed to justify its existence to the people paying for it. Administrators began accepting more patients. The building grew. The staff grew, though not always in quality. And somewhere in that expansion, something important got lost. The original impulse towards shelter and compassion began to be replaced by something colder, something more like containment. By the 1600s, Bethlem had developed a reputation that drew visitors from across London. And I mean visitors literally. People would pay a penny later raised to a few pence to walk through the wards and observe the patients. On busy days, the place reportedly drew crowds of several hundred sightseers. Families brought their children. Young couples came as a form of entertainment. The patients were on display. Now here is where I want to pause and sit with something uncomfortable. Because when we hear this today, our immediate reaction is outrage. How could they? What kind of society treats suffering human beings as a spectacle? And yet, and I genuinely mean this as a question, not a condemnation, are we entirely sure we are so different? We watch reality television built around people having breakdowns. We scroll through videos of strangers in crisis. We have built entire entertainment industries around voyeurism. I am not saying it is the same. I am saying the impulse, this strange dark human pull toward watching other people's suffering did not begin in the 1600s, and it did not end there either. But back to Bethlem. By the late 1600s, the institution had outgrown its original building entirely. In 1676, a magnificent new Bethlem was constructed in Moorfields, a grand palatial building that looked from the outside almost absurdly elegant. Visitors compared it favourably to the palace at Versailles. Decorative columns, ornate gates, a long, sweeping facade. The architect wanted it to project an image of order and reason. Inside, the reality was something else. The wards were long, dark corridors lined with small cells. Patients were chained to the walls in some cases or confined to beds with iron rings. The heating was unreliable, meaning winters could be genuinely dangerous for people who were already physically weakened. Food was minimal. One physician who visited in the early 1700s described the smell alone as overwhelming, a combination of unwashed bodies, damp stone, and something he could not quite name but found deeply distressing. And yet here is a detail that I find achingly human. Even in those conditions, some patients decorated their cells. They drew on the walls, they arranged small objects on the windowsill, they planted tiny gardens in whatever patches of dirt they could reach from the end of their chains. People even in the darkest circumstances find ways to make a space their own. By 1814, a reformer named Edward Wakefield arrived unannounced at Bethlem and discovered a patient named James Norris, an American sailor admitted in 1795 and described in his records as violent. The staff had built for him a special restraining apparatus, a system of iron bars and collars that kept him almost completely immobile. He could move his arms about a foot in either direction. Nothing more. He had lived like this for 9 years. Wakefield brought an artist to sketch Norris in his restraints. That sketch was reproduced in newspapers across Britain. The public was horrified. Parliamentary hearings followed, and here is the detail that gets me every time. When the inspectors spoke to James Norris, he was lucid, calm. He answered their questions clearly and without apparent bitterness, describing his daily existence with a quiet dignity that must have made the contrast with his physical situation almost unbearable to witness. He died just a few months after being released from the apparatus. 9 years of near-total immobility had destroyed his body even as his mind apparently remained intact. The scandal became one of the great catalysts for reform. His story was repeated in pamphlets and speeches and parliamentary debates for years. He became a symbol, not just of Bethlem's failures, but of an entire system's failure to see mentally ill people as fully human. But even as reform efforts were gathering momentum, Bethlem was also producing something unexpected, genuine curiosity, and with curiosity occasionally something approaching insight. In the early 19th century, physicians at Bethlem began keeping far more detailed patient records than had ever been attempted before. They started noting not just diagnoses which at this point were crude categories like mania, melancholia, and idiocy, but also patient histories, family backgrounds, reported life events, descriptions of behavior over time. There are letters in those archives written by patients to family members who never replied. There are lists of possessions that patients brought with them on admission, a hairbrush, a Bible, a locket with no photograph inside. There are notes in the margins of medical records added by staff who had clearly grown fond of particular patients, little observations like, "seems brighter today," or "asked after her children again." These are the details that history books tend to skip past. But they are the ones that make the story real. By 1815, Bethlem moved to a new building in Southwark, the site it occupies to this day. And with that move came the beginning of something genuinely different. A physician named William Charles Hood took over in 1852 and began dismantling many of the old practices. Chains were removed, patients were given more freedom, entertainment was organised, concerts, dances, theatrical performances put on by the patients themselves. There is a lithograph from this era that I find both beautiful and heartbreaking. It shows patients at a Victorian asylum dancing together at a ball, dressed in their best clothes, the room lit with candles. They look in that moment like people at any Victorian social gathering. And they were. That was entirely the point. So when you picture Bethlem, when the word Bedlam floats into your mind trailing all its dark associations, I want you to hold two images simultaneously. The iron collar around James Norris, and the candles at the ball, because that is what history actually is. Not a single image, not a simple story of monsters and victims, but something far more tangled and far more human than that. And speaking of trying, in the next part of our journey, we're going to meet the reformers who looked at places like Bethlem and decided things could be genuinely radically different. Not just better, transformed. The movement they built had a name, a philosophy, and for a brief luminous moment in history it actually worked. Stay with me. There is a particular kind of hope that is almost dangerous in its purity. It is the kind of hope that believes completely and without reservation that if you simply create the right conditions, the right environment, the right structure, the right amount of light and air and human kindness, you can heal almost anything. It is a beautiful belief. It has driven some of the greatest reforms in human history, and it has also more than once collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. The reformers who built the moral treatment movement carried exactly that kind of hope, and for a few extraordinary decades in the early 1800s they had the evidence to back it up. You might remember from our earlier conversation that the retreat in York had shown something remarkable, treating mentally ill patients with dignity and routine rather than chains and punishment produced significantly better outcomes. But a single small institution housing 30 people is not a revolution. It is a proof of concept. The revolution came later when a generation of physicians looked at what Tuke had done and asked, what if we scaled this up? The man who became the living symbol of that ambition was named John Connolly, and his story is one of the most genuinely moving and genuinely cautionary in the entire history of psychiatry. Connolly was not born to privilege or power. He spent much of his early career struggling financially, moving from position to position, writing books that were admired but not particularly well paid. He had a gift for observation, and an even rarer gift, the ability to look at an accepted practice and ask plainly whether it was actually working. In 1839, at the age of 47, which by the standards of the era was rather late in a career to have a defining moment, he was appointed resident physician at the Hanwell Asylum in Middlesex, just outside London. Hanwell was enormous by the standards of the day. It had been built to house around 500 patients, and when Connolly arrived it was still using mechanical restraints, straitjackets, leather straps, iron hobbles on the ankles as a routine management tool, not out of cruelty necessarily, out of habit, out of the belief that there was simply no other way. Within months of his arrival, Connolly banned all mechanical restraints at Hanwell, every single one. His colleagues were, to put it gently, sceptical. Some predicted catastrophe. Without restraints, they argued, violent patients would harm themselves, harm the staff, harm each other. Connolly listened to these concerns, noted them carefully, and proceeded anyway. What happened next is worth savouring. Violence at Hanwell did not increase. In many cases, it decreased. Patients who had been agitated and combative, partly Connolly believed because of the indignity and physical discomfort of being restrained, became calmer when the restraints were removed. Staff injuries went down. A visiting justice of the peace inspecting Hanwell shortly after the reforms were implemented wrote that the patients were being treated with what he called uniform kindness and forbearance. Uniform kindness. That was the goal. Not cure was too ambitious and too uncertain. Just consistent daily ordinary kindness. Meals served at regular times. Patients addressed by their names rather than by their diagnoses. Gardens to walk in. Work to do, purposeful activity chosen when possible to match a patient's interests and abilities. Now I want to ask you something. Think about your own life for a moment. Think about what happens to your state of mind when you have routine purpose and the simple experience of being treated with basic respect. Think about how much harder everything becomes when those things are absent. We do not usually think of ourselves as being that fragile, but most of us know from experience that we actually are. Connolly understood this about his patients 200 years before modern psychology had the language to fully explain it. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a woman was about to do something that would transform the landscape of mental health care across an entire continent, and she was going to do it essentially alone, armed with nothing but a notebook and an iron determination. Her name was Dorothea Dix. She was a school teacher from Massachusetts, and in 1841 she agreed to teach a Sunday school class at a local prison. What she found there changed the course of her life and eventually American history. In the cells at the East Cambridge jail, Dorothea Dix found mentally ill people being held alongside criminals, not because they had committed crimes, but because there was simply nowhere else for them to go. The cells were unheated. When Dix asked the jailer about the lack of heating, he told her reportedly without much concern that the insane did not feel the cold. She knew that was wrong, and she decided with a methodical and almost terrifying calm to prove it. Over the next 18 months, Dorothea Dix travelled to every correctional facility, almshouse and poorhouse in the state of Massachusetts. She took notes. She recorded conditions. She spoke to inmates and keepers and local officials. And in 1843 she presented her findings to the Massachusetts state legislature in a document that began with words that still carry weight. Today I come to present the strong claims of suffering humanity. The report documented mentally ill people being kept in cages, in closets, in stalls, in pens, people chained, people left without shelter in New England winters. The legislature was embarrassed into action. New facilities were funded, and Dix, rather than stopping, continued. She visited state after state, presenting reports, lobbying legislatures, shaming the comfortable into caring about the uncomfortable. By the time she was done, Dorothea Dix had directly influenced the founding of 32 mental hospitals across the United States and Canada. 32. One woman with a notebook and a righteous fury reshaped an entire continent's approach to mental illness, and the hospitals built partly in response to her advocacy were often designed according to a philosophy that had become by the 1850s something close to gospel in the field the Kirkbride plan. Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride was a Philadelphia physician who'd become convinced that the building itself could be a form of medicine. His design became one of the most recognizable architectural plans in American history. The Kirkbride Asylum was built in the shape of a shallow V, a long central building with wings extending outward at angles on either side like a bird with its wings slightly spread. This was not aesthetic. It was intentional. The angled wings meant that every patient ward received direct sunlight at some point during the day. Fresh air circulated through the corridors. The grounds were carefully landscaped gardens, walking paths, a working farm. Kirkbride believed with genuine conviction that a patient who woke to a view of an ordered, beautiful landscape was already in some small way receiving treatment. More than 70 institutions were built to Kirkbride's specifications between 1850 and 1900. Many of them are still standing today, grand haunting stone buildings on hills across the American Northeast and Midwest, long since abandoned, their windows dark and their floors decaying. They have become beloved by urban explorers and horror enthusiasts, which is a strange kind of afterlife for buildings that were designed as monuments to hope. But here is the painful paradox at the heart of this entire movement. The very success of moral treatment, the genuine improvements it produced, the evidence it generated, the momentum it created led directly to its downfall. Because success attracted patients, and patients filled beds, and filled beds required more staff, and money was always the constraint. By the 1860s and 70s, the large asylums built to embody Connolly's principles were housing 500 patients, then 1,000, then 1,500. The ratio of staff to patients ballooned to the point where individualized attention became physically impossible. One attendant responsible for 40 patients cannot treat those patients with uniform kindness, not because the attendant is a bad person, but because it is mathematically impossible. The vision had outgrown its own foundations, and what was left, the large building, the grounds, the official philosophy of humane care, became increasingly a kind of fiction, a beautiful story that institutions told about themselves while the reality inside the wards drifted further and further from the ideal. John Connolly lived long enough to see this happening. He died in 1866, and by then some of the journalists and reformers who had once celebrated him were writing critically about the institutions the moral treatment movement had produced. He had spent his career arguing that if you changed what happened inside the walls, you could change the outcomes. He had been right on a small scale. What he had not fully reckoned with was the problem of scale itself. It is a lesson that turns up again and again in the history of institutions, and honestly in the history of almost any ambitious human project. The solution that works beautifully at 30 people tends to transform somewhere around 500 into something its founders would no longer recognize. So now we have the building, we have the philosophy, we have the good intentions and the architectural blueprints and the passionate reformers. We have all the structures of care in place. What we have not yet looked at, and what most people, when they think of Victorian asylums, most want to know, is what life actually felt like for the people living inside those walls. Not the physicians, not the administrators, the patients themselves. What did they eat? What did they wear? What did a Tuesday in October feel like in a ward in a Victorian asylum when the light was thin and the corridors were long, and you were not entirely sure whether you would ever leave? That is exactly where we are headed next. Close your eyes for just a moment. Not to sleep not yet, but to imagine. Imagine waking up and not knowing what day it is, not in the pleasant, disoriented way you might wake up on a vacation morning when the not knowing feels like freedom. I mean truly not knowing. Not knowing the day, not knowing the month with any certainty, not knowing whether the season outside your window has changed since you last paid attention. Imagine that the walls around you are the same walls they were yesterday, and the day before and the month before that, and that the most pressing question you have, the one that sits quietly at the back of every thought, all day every day, is not when am I getting better, but simply am I ever going home? That was the interior landscape of a Victorian asylum patient, and today we are going to spend some time inside it. 6 o'clock in the morning. That is when it began in most Victorian asylums in both Britain and the United States. The attendants, often underpaid, frequently undertrained, sometimes genuinely compassionate and sometimes not, would move through the long dormitory wards waking patients. The dormitory wards in a pauper asylum could contain anywhere from 20 to 60 beds depending on the institution and the era. The beds were typically iron-framed, narrow, and covered with a straw or horsehair mattress. By the 1860s and 70s, as overcrowding worsened, the space between beds had shrunk to the point where one medical inspector noted in an official report that patients could touch their neighbours on either side simply by stretching out their arms. Now contrast that with the private ward experience, because the difference is so stark it almost feels like two different institutions sharing the same address. A paying patient might have a private room, or at minimum share a room with only one or two others. They had their own furniture. In the more expensive private asylums, they might bring their own belongings, their own books, their own personal items. The food was better. And crucially, the private patient was addressed with a level of basic courtesy that the pauper patient might never experience at all. It is one of the most uncomfortable truths of the asylum era. The quality of your mental health care in Victorian England depended enormously on how much money your family had, which is, if you think about it, not entirely unlike the situation in many parts of the world today. A thought worth sitting with. But let us stay with the pauper patient for now, because theirs is the story that is least often told. After waking, patients were escorted to washing facilities, communal, cold and brief. Thorough bathing was a weekly affair at best, and yet here is a detail that always catches people off guard. For many patients admitted from the poorest urban areas, the asylum actually represented an improvement in basic hygiene over whatever conditions they had been living in before. The asylum as an upgrade. It was not the intention of the reformers, but for some patients it was the reality. Breakfast was served around 7 o'clock. The commissioners in lunacy, who were responsible for inspecting asylums under the Lunacy Act of 1845, kept detailed records of patient menus. One set of records from a Middlesex asylum in the 1860s shows a weekly rotation that included beef stew, boiled mutton bread pudding, and a weekly ration of beer, yes, beer, which was considered at the time to be nutritionally valuable and mildly therapeutic. I will let you decide how you feel about that particular medical theory. After breakfast came work. And this is where the asylum experience becomes genuinely complicated, because the question of patient labour is one that historians still argue about today. The theory which had genuine merit and which modern occupational therapy has largely vindicated was that purposeful, structured activity helped regulate mood-build routine and give patients a sense of contribution and dignity. Men were assigned to the asylum farm, to kitchens, to the carpentry shop. Women almost universally were assigned to sewing, laundry and domestic cleaning. On the other hand, by the 1870s and 1880s, when the asylums were chronically understaffed and desperately underfunded, the work patients performed was not merely therapeutic. It was functionally necessary. Patients were doing the work that would otherwise have required paid staff, the laundry that kept the institution running, the farming that helped feed the population, There is a meaningful difference between workers' medicine and workers' exploitation, and the line between them became increasingly difficult to locate as the century wore on. I find myself genuinely uncertain about how to judge this, and I think that uncertainty is actually the right response. The midday meal was the largest of the day, served around noon. Then came the afternoon, given over to what the Victorians called recreation. This included organised games on the lawn, walking in the grounds, and in some asylums more formal activities. The West Riding Asylum in Yorkshire, which kept some of the most detailed patient records of the entire era, had a small orchestra made up entirely of patients by the 1870s. They performed regularly for both patients and staff. I genuinely love that detail. The idea of patients in a 19th century asylum playing Handel in a concert hall, an audience of fellow patients applauding from wooden chairs, late afternoon brought religious observance. Chapel attendance was not optional in most Victorian asylums. The assumption, which reflected the era's beliefs more than any evidence, was that religious practice was inherently stabilizing for the troubled mind. Supper came around 6 o'clock. Bread, perhaps cheese, perhaps a soup, and then the paraldehyde. Paraldehyde was introduced into clinical practice in Britain in 1882. It was a sedative, powerful, fast-acting, and with an extraordinarily strong smell that those who encountered it tended to describe as somewhere between alcohol and rotten fruit. It was given to patients after the evening meal to, as one institutional record put it, with wonderful Victorian directness, quieten them down for the night and make it easier for the nurses to get everyone to bed. Read that sentence again. Quieten them down. Make it easier for the nurses. There is something in that phrasing that tells you everything about how the balance of power had shifted in the late Victorian asylum. It was not about the patient's experience of falling asleep. It was about the staff's ability to manage the ward. The therapeutic language remained. This was still officially a medical intervention, but the operational reality had become something closer to chemical management. Now let me tell you about Thomas. He was admitted to the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum in West Yorkshire in the year 1881. Middle-aged. His diagnosis was recorded as chronic mania. In the 26 years he spent in the asylum before his death in 1907, he received various tonics and laxatives, had his temperature charted regularly, his reflexes tested, his eyes examined. He was photographed. After his death, his heart was preserved for the asylum's on-site collection of anatomical specimens, and his case was written up for publication in a medical journal. He was by the clinical measure of his era well cared for. What Thomas's records do not tell us is what he thought about, what he missed, whether there was a particular time of year when the homesickness was worse, whether he had friends on the ward. The records tell us what was done to him. They do not tell us who he was. And that gap between the clinical record and the human being is one of the most profound silences in the entire history of the Victorian asylum. Thousands of people lived and died inside those walls. We have their intake forms, their diagnosis sheets, their medication records, their death certificates. What we rarely have is their voice. Except, and this is where the story opens up again, sometimes we do. Sometimes in the margins of a medical record, a patient wrote something, a date they were waiting for, a name they kept repeating, a drawing pressed between the pages of a case file, small survivals of inner life sneaking through the official record like light under a door. In the next part of our journey, we're going to look more carefully at who exactly was behind those doors. Because one of the most disturbing truths about the Victorian asylum system is that not everyone inside was there because they needed to be. And the question of who got committed and why reveals something about Victorian society that is far more unsettling than anything happening in the wards. The doors are about to open. and some of what is on the other side will surprise you. Let me read you something. I want you to just listen for a moment, because what I am about to share is real. These are actual recorded reasons for admission to Victorian asylums, pulled directly from institutional records of the era. Official documents, medical assessments signed by licensed physicians, cause of insanity novel reading, cause of insanity overaction of the mind, cause of insanity political excitement, cause of insanity jealousy, cause of insanity grief, cause of insanity masturbation, cause of insanity ill treatment by husband, cause of insanity reading the Bible too intently, and at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in what is now the state of West Virginia, cause of insanity book reading. Book reading. Someone sat across a desk from a frightened human being, observed that they liked to read, and wrote it down as evidence of mental illness. Now, take a breath. Because we need to talk about who was actually inside those walls. We have spent the last few chapters learning about the physical reality of the Victorian asylum, the buildings, the routines, the food, the labour, the long corridors and the iron beds, and all of that matters. But this chapter is about something that cuts deeper than architecture or daily schedule. It is about the question of legitimacy, about who decided who belonged inside those walls, and about what that decision tells us about the society that made it. Here is the uncomfortable truth. A significant number of the people committed to Victorian asylums did not meet any definition of mental illness that we would recognise today. They were committed for other reasons entirely, for being poor, for being inconvenient, for being female and having opinions, for being foreign and not speaking the language, for being old and having no one left to care for them, for grieving too loudly or loving too intensely or thinking too independently, and the system that allowed this was not on its face designed to be cruel. It was designed to be efficient. Under the Lunacy Act of 1845, the process for committing a person to an asylum required two things: a certificate signed by a physician and a statement from a family member or local official confirming that the person was a danger to themselves or others, or simply unable to care for themselves. That is it. 2 signatures. And once those signatures were in place, a person could be removed from their life and placed inside an institution with no trial, no formal appeal process, no requirement that their family ever visit again. 2 signatures. Think about that. One historian, who examined commitment records from a private asylum in Ontario, the Homewood Retreat, found that the single most common initiating factor in patient admissions was not a medical referral or a public disturbance. It was a family member. Specifically, it was usually a husband, a father, or a brother. The family, in other words, was the primary gateway to the asylum, and families, being human institutions rather than medical ones, committed people for reasons that had nothing to do with psychiatry. Some of those reasons were genuinely compassionate. A family watching a loved one suffer with no other resources available, making an agonizing decision. That happened. It happened often, and it deserves acknowledgement. But some of those reasons were not compassionate at all. They were about money, convenience, embarrassment, or control. A wife whose inheritance a husband wanted access to. An elderly parent whose care had become burdensome. A daughter who had refused a marriage or expressed views that shamed the family. A son whose behaviour, perhaps a refusal to follow a prescribed path, was socially unacceptable in a world with no tolerance for deviation. The records are full of these cases if you know how to read them. They are written in the careful clinical language of Victorian medicine, which has a way of laundering almost anything into respectability. But read carefully enough, and the human situation beneath the medical phrasing becomes visible. Consider what the records from Cornwall Asylum between 1870 and 1875 show us. Of 511 admissions in that 5-year period, all were classified as paupers, meaning their care was publicly funded, meaning they had no money and no powerful family advocates. The most common recorded cause of their illnesses was listed simply as unknown. Not some exotic psychiatric condition. Unknown. Which tells you that these were people who had been placed in an institution primarily because they had no one to protect them and no resources with which to protect themselves. Poverty, it turns out, was one of the most reliable predictors of asylum admission in the Victorian era. Not because poverty causes madness, though the stress and deprivation associated with extreme poverty certainly did create real mental health consequences, but because poverty removed the safety nets that kept people out of institutions. If you had a large family with enough income, a troubled relative could be cared for at home. If you had wealth, you could access private care. But if you were alone and poor, the asylum was often simply where you ended up when the world had no other container for you. Now I want to talk specifically about women because the story of women in Victorian asylums deserves careful attention, and I want to approach it honestly. Victorian society had a very particular set of expectations for women. They were expected to be domestic, submissive, cheerful, and above all controllable. These expectations were not just social norms, they were embedded in medical theory. Victorian physicians, almost all of whom were men, had developed elaborate frameworks for understanding the female nervous system as inherently more fragile, more susceptible to emotional disturbance, more easily tipped from health into disorder. This meant that behaviours which in a man might be described as spirited or strong-willed were in a woman potential symptoms. A woman who argued persistently with her husband could be described as exhibiting morbid excitement. A woman who expressed strong religious conviction might be flagged for religious mania. A woman who simply refused to perform the expected cheerfulness of Victorian femininity could find that refusal interpreted as evidence of depression. The records from the Bodmin Asylum in Cornwall contain a case I keep returning to. A woman admitted in the early 1870s listed with the diagnosis of mania with delusions, the recorded cause of her illness ill-treatment by husband. She was not admitted because she was dangerous. She was not admitted because she was unable to function. She was admitted as best as one can read the situation from the surviving paperwork because she was distressed, visibly, persistently, inconveniently distressed by a marriage that was causing her genuine harm. And the institutional response to that distress was to classify the distress itself as the problem. I do not think the physicians who wrote her admission papers were monsters. I think they were operating within the only framework available to them, a framework that did not have the conceptual tools to ask whether the problem might lie not in the woman's mind but in her circumstances. That is not an excuse, but it is an explanation, and it matters because it reminds us that harm does not require malice. It only requires the wrong framework applied with enough confidence. The situation for immigrant patients was different in its particulars but similar in structure. In the United States, particularly, the asylum population of the late 19th century included a substantial and growing number of recent arrivals, Irish, German, Italian, Eastern European, who had come to America with no established social networks, no English, and no understanding of the legal systems that governed their lives. When these individuals experience mental health crises and the combination of poverty, displacement, isolation, and cultural dislocation produced real psychological distress in significant numbers, they found themselves in front of physicians who could not communicate with them and who had no interpreters available. The clinical assessment of a person who cannot understand the questions being asked is, to put it charitably, limited, and yet assessments were made, and on the basis of those assessments, people were committed. Some of them stayed for years. Some of them stayed for the rest of their lives. One investigator who documented conditions at Blackwell's Island Asylum in New York in the 1880s found women who had been committed simply because they were foreign distressed and could not explain themselves in English. Their families in some cases did not know where they were. The investigator described speaking to a woman who had been in the institution for several months, asking to go home, and being told she was not well enough when the primary evidence of her illness was that she did not respond coherently to questions she could not understand. And yet, I want to be careful here because the story is not only one of injustice. The asylum also genuinely helped people. There were patients who arrived in states of real crisis and who through the structure and relative safety of institutional life stabilized. There were patients who would have harmed themselves without intervention, who benefited from a period of supervised care. The existence of misuse does not cancel the existence of genuine need. Both things were true simultaneously in the same building, sometimes on the same wards. That ambiguity, the simultaneous reality of genuine care and genuine injustice, is one of the hardest things to hold about the Victorian asylum. We want a cleaner story. We want the asylum to be either a refuge or a prison. But it was depending on who you were and when you arrived and who was running the ward that week, sometimes one and sometimes the other, and sometimes both at the same time. The question of who belonged inside those walls was never fully resolved in the Victorian era, and honestly it echoes in questions we're still asking today about involuntary psychiatric holds, about the criteria for commitment, about the line between protection and control. We're not as far from those admission ledgers as we sometimes like to think, but there is one more door we've not yet opened. We've talked about who was inside. We've not yet talked about what the physicians were actually doing to them, the treatments they believed in, the experiments they conducted, the theories they pursued, with the confidence of people who had very little actual knowledge and an enormous amount of institutional authority. Some of what happened in the treatment rooms of Victorian asylums was well-intentioned and useless. Some of it was well-intentioned and actively harmful, and some of it, even by the standards of its own era, crosses a line that is hard to look at directly. That is where we're going next. Picture a wooden chair. Sturdy, well-built, the kind of thing you might find in any respectable Victorian parlour. Now imagine that chair mounted on a vertical axle engineered to spin. Fast. Controlled by a hand crank operated by a member of staff standing a few feet away. And imagine being strapped into it. This was Cox's chair, named after the physician Joseph Mason Cox, who introduced it into British asylum practice in the early 1800s, and wrote about it with genuine enthusiasm in his medical treatise on insanity. The theory was elegant in its simplicity. Mental illness was believed by many Victorian physicians to be partly a disorder of circulation. The brain was not receiving blood in the correct quantity or at the correct pressure. Spin the patient fast enough, the thinking went, and centrifugal force would redistribute that blood, restoring the proper balance, and with it the proper functioning of the mind. Whether any patient ever reported feeling better after being strapped into a spinning chair and whirled at speed for several minutes, the historical record does not clearly say. What it does say is that patients frequently vomited, which the physicians of the era noted in their case records as evidence that the treatment was working. The body was purging itself of whatever was causing the disorder. I want to pause there for a moment because I find that detail genuinely fascinating rather than simply horrifying. The physicians who designed and used Cox's chair were not people who enjoyed watching others suffer. They were people trying to make sense of something they did not understand using the conceptual tools available to them, tools that were by modern standards completely wrong, but that were by the standards of their era reasonable extrapolations from accepted medical theory. The same circulatory logic that led to Cox's chair also led to the almost universal Victorian medical practice of bloodletting, which had been mainstream medicine for literally 2,000 years before anyone thought to seriously question it. This is the hardest thing to hold about Victorian psychiatric treatment. Most of it was not cruelty masquerading as medicine. Most of it was medicine, genuine, earnest, carefully theorized medicine that happened to be wrong. The cruelty was not usually the intention, it was the byproduct, but not always, and it is important to be honest about that too. Let us talk about water, because the story of hydrotherapy in Victorian asylums is one of the most complex in this entire history, a treatment that began with real therapeutic potential and ended in some institutions somewhere much darker. The therapeutic use of water had respectable origins. Cold baths had been used in medicine since antiquity. By the early Victorian era, hydrotherapy had developed into a serious discipline. Spa towns like Malvern and Harrogate drew thousands of visitors who genuinely believed that immersion in particular waters could address everything from gout to nervous exhaustion. And there was something to it. Cold water immersion does affect the nervous system. It triggers physiological responses, a slowing of the heart rate, a shift in circulation, a documented effect on mood and alertness. The science was primitive, but it was not entirely without foundation. In asylum practice, hydrotherapy took several forms. The most benign was the warm bath, long slow immersion in water of a regulated temperature, sometimes lasting several hours, specifically designed to produce a state of calm relaxation in agitated patients. Attendants would sit beside the tub, talking quietly to the patient, monitoring their state. Some patients reportedly found this genuinely soothing, and modern research on the therapeutic effects of warm water immersion on anxiety suggests they were not wrong to. The less benign forms are harder to discuss with the same equanimity. The cold douche, essentially, a powerful jet of cold water directed at a standing patient, was used in many institutions as a means of managing behavior that staff found difficult to control. Officially, it was a medical treatment. In practice, it functioned as much as a deterrent as a therapy. Patients who knew the cold douche was available as a response to certain behaviors learned quickly to modify those behaviors. Whether that modification represented genuine improvement in their mental state, or simply a learned suppression of visible symptoms in order to avoid an unpleasant experience, is a question the physicians of the era rarely asked. And then there is the wet pack, a patient wrapped tightly in sheets soaked in cold water, left in that state for anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours. Used for highly agitated patients with genuine therapeutic intent, the theory being that physical constraint combined with thermal shock would calm an overexcited nervous system. In some cases it did. In others, patients found it terrifying, claustrophobic and deeply distressing, which tends to produce the opposite of calm. I keep coming back to this word intent, because in the history of Victorian psychiatric treatment intent matters, and yet it is also in some ways beside the point. The patient strapped into the wet pack did not experience the physician's good intentions. They experienced the cold and the constriction and the inability to move. The subjective reality of the treatment was determined by what it felt like, not by the theory that motivated it. Now, I have to tell you about Henry Cotton, because Henry Cotton is in my view one of the most genuinely disturbing figures in the entire history of psychiatry, and also strangely one of the most instructive. Henry Cotton was an American physician who became medical director of the Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey in the year 1907. He was by all contemporary accounts intelligent, energetic, and passionately committed to helping his patients. He genuinely believed he was on the verge of solving mental illness, and the theory he developed and acted on with extraordinary consequences was this: mental illness is caused by infection. Specifically, Cotton believed that bacteria accumulating in various sites of focal infection throughout the body were releasing toxins that travelled to the brain and disrupted its functioning. The solution, therefore, was surgical. Remove the infected tissue, and you remove the cause of the mental illness. This was not, in 1910, an entirely fringe idea. The concept of focal sepsis, the notion that localized infections in one part of the body could cause systemic disease, was a mainstream medical theory of the era. Cotton took it further than almost anyone else, but he did not invent it. What he did was apply it to his patients with a thoroughness that is difficult even now to fully comprehend. It started with teeth. Cotton believed that dental infections were a primary source of the toxins he was targeting. So he began extracting teeth. Not the obviously diseased ones, all of them in many cases. Patients at Trenton State Hospital were subjected to wholesale tooth extraction as a standard part of admission. By the 1910s and 20s, thousands of patients had lost all or most of their teeth on the theory that this would improve their mental health. When the tooth extractions did not produce the improvements Cotton expected, he expanded the theory. He moved to the tonsils, then to sections of the colon, then to the cervix and ovaries in female patients. The surgeries became more extensive, more invasive, and more dangerous. Cotton's own data, reported with evident pride, suggested recovery rates of around 85% from his surgical approach. Independent investigators who examined the same data found something quite different: a surgical mortality rate that was in some periods genuinely alarming. Cotton died in 1933, still believing in his theory, still performing his surgeries, still writing papers, arguing that focal sepsis was the key to understanding mental illness. He was never criminally investigated. His institution continued operating for years after his death. And when his approach finally fell out of favour, it did so quietly, without the public reckoning that his patients, many of whom had died on his operating table or lived out their days without their teeth and without their health, might have deserved. I find Henry Cotton genuinely difficult to categorize. He was not a sadist. He was not someone who enjoyed his patients' suffering. He was someone who believed completely and absolutely in what he was doing, which makes him in some ways more frightening than a simple villain would be. Because the lesson of Henry Cotton is not that evil people do terrible things. It is that genuinely good intentions combined with unquestioned confidence and unchecked institutional authority can produce outcomes that are indistinguishable from deliberate harm. That lesson deserves more attention than history has generally given it. Now I want to offer you a moment of genuine contrast, because not everything happening in Victorian treatment rooms was ineffective or harmful, and it would be dishonest to tell only the difficult parts of this story. The early experiments with occupational therapy were producing real evidence of benefit by the 1870s and 1880s. The use of music as a therapeutic tool, cautiously explored in several progressive institutions, anticipated by decades what we now recognize as music therapy. Some asylum physicians were keeping detailed longitudinal records of patient outcomes that, while methodologically crude by modern standards, represented genuine attempts at evidence-based practice. The impulse towards scientific rigor, even when the science itself was wrong, contained the seeds of something better. And then there were the individual physicians who, simply by treating their patients with basic human dignity and taking the time to actually listen to them, produced outcomes that their more interventionist colleagues could not match. The records show again and again that patients responded to kindness, not as a cure, but as a meaningful improvement in daily experience and sometimes in actual clinical outcomes. The irony is almost unbearable. The most effective thing a Victorian asylum physician could often do for their patients was also the simplest and the cheapest. Sit down, ask questions, and actually hear the answers. It required no equipment, no theory, no spinning chair, no cold water, no surgical intervention. Just attention. Just the radical act of treating another person as though their inner experience mattered. And yet it was the spinning chairs and the surgical theatres that got the research funding, the published papers, the professional prestige. The physicians who listened quietly to their patients are mostly forgotten. The ones who built elaborate theories and dramatic interventions are the ones history preserved. There is probably a lesson in that too, though I will leave it to you to decide what it is. The story of those physicians who they were, what drove them, what they actually understood about the minds they were trying to treat, is where we are headed next. Because behind the treatments and the theories and the case records, there were human beings conducting one of the most ambitious and most uncertain scientific projects in history, the attempt to understand what happens when the human mind begins to work against itself. Some of what they found was remarkable. Some of it was catastrophically wrong, and the line between the two was more often than any of them would have liked to admit invisible until it was too late. There is a word that has almost completely disappeared from modern English, and I think its disappearance tells us something important about how much our understanding of mental illness has changed over the past 2 centuries. The word is alienist. In the Victorian era, that was what you called a physician who specialised in the care of the mentally ill. Not a psychiatrist, that word existed, but it was newer and less commonly used. An alienist. And the reasoning behind the term is worth pausing on because it reveals something about how the profession understood its own purpose. The mentally ill in the medical thinking of the era had become alienated, separated, estranged from their own reason. Their minds had in some fundamental sense become foreign to them, and the alienist was the specialist whose job it was to bridge that estrangement, to reach across the gap between the rational mind and whatever had replaced it, and ideally to guide the patient back. There is something almost poetic about that framing, and something, if you think about it long enough, genuinely compassionate. The alienist was not there to punish irrationality. They were there to understand it, to make contact with the part of the person that had become, in that evocative Victorian phrase, alien to themselves. Whether they succeeded and how they tried is the story of this chapter. The Victorian asylum physician occupied a peculiar position in the medical world. On one hand, they had the prestige of running large, well-funded institutions with significant staffs and considerable public visibility. On the other hand, they were widely regarded by the rest of the medical profession as occupying something of a backwater. The physicians who treated body surgeons, physicians working on infectious disease, the scientists building the new bacteriology, were the ones doing exciting, measurable, progressive work. The alienists were dealing with something that resisted measurement, resisted clear diagnosis, and showed an infuriating tendency to resist cure. This professional anxiety drove a great deal of what happened in the treatment rooms and the research laboratories of Victorian asylums. The alienists were trying to prove that they were real scientists dealing with a real science, and that pressure shaped everything, including some of the field's worst mistakes. One of the most influential figures in this story is a man named James Cowles Pritchard, a Bristol physician who published a work in 1835 that quietly changed the boundaries of what could be considered mental illness. The book was called Treatise on Insanity, and its most significant contribution was a concept Pritchard called moral insanity. Before Pritchard, the common understanding of insanity was relatively binary. Either a person had delusions, beliefs about the world that were clearly false and fixed, or they were hearing voices or seeing things that were not there. If neither of those was present, the person was legally and medically sane, troubled perhaps, difficult, socially problematic, but sane. Pritchard changed that. Moral insanity, as he defined it, was a condition in which the emotional and behavioral faculties of the mind were disordered, while the intellectual faculties remained intact. A person could think clearly, and logically could understand the world around them, could hold a coherent conversation, and still be classified as mentally ill because their behavior and emotional responses did not conform to expected social norms. Do you see the problem with that definition? I hope you do, because it is significant. If mental illness can exist without any disturbance of thought or perception, if it is defined primarily by deviation from behavioral and emotional norms, then the definition of mental illness becomes dependent on whatever those norms happen to be. In a society with rigid expectations about how women should behave or how immigrants should present themselves, or how the poor should conduct their lives, the concept of moral insanity becomes a very flexible tool indeed. Pritchard himself was not trying to create an instrument of social control. He was trying to describe something real, the phenomenon we might now recognize as personality disorder or antisocial behavior, or certain forms of depression that present primarily as behavioral change. His clinical instincts were in some ways ahead of his time, but the framework he created outlived his intentions, and it was used in the decades that followed to justify commitments that had nothing to do with genuine mental illness. Now let me tell you about a photographer, because one of the strangest and most fascinating chapters in the history of Victorian psychiatry is the story of what happened when the alienists got their hands on cameras. Hugh Welch Diamond was the medical superintendent of the female department of the Surrey County Asylum in the 1850s, and he became one of the earliest practitioners of what he called medical photography, the systematic photographing of patients as a diagnostic and therapeutic tool. Diamond believed with the earnest conviction that characterized so many Victorian intellectual projects that the face revealed the mind, that the external signs of mental illness, the particular set of the jaw, the quality of the gaze, the posture of the body could be read by a trained observer and used to diagnose and classify conditions. He photographed his patients in poses meant to capture the characteristic expression of their particular diagnosis. A woman with melancholia photographed in one way, a woman with mania photographed in another. The photographs were exhibited at the Royal Society in 1856, and they were received with considerable interest because they offered something that the field of psychiatry desperately wanted and had never quite achieved: visible, reproducible, shareable evidence of mental states. The fact that this evidence was largely illusory, that the poses Diamond arranged told us far more about his own diagnostic assumptions than about the inner states of his subjects, did not become clear for quite some time. The photographs survived. Many of them are still viewable in archives today, and when you look at them you see not diagnostic categories made visible, but simply women. Women in an asylum looking at a camera carrying whatever they carried, while a physician pointed a lens at them and tried to turn their suffering into data. I find those photographs genuinely moving in a way that is hard to articulate. They are one of the clearest windows we have into the human reality of the Victorian Asylum, not because they show us what Diamond thought they showed, but because they preserve faces. Individual, specific, unrepeatable human faces connected to individual, specific, unrepeatable lives that the institution tried to flatten into categories. Meanwhile, in the pathological laboratories becoming standard features of the larger Victorian asylums by the 1870s and 1880s, a different kind of investigation was underway. The alienists had become fascinated with the brain itself, the physical organ that they were increasingly convinced must hold the secret of mental illness somewhere within it. The West Riding Asylum in Yorkshire developed one of the most significant pathological research programs in Victorian psychiatry. Under the direction of James Crichton Browne, who became its medical director in 1866 at the age of just 24, the asylum attracted some of the leading neurological scientists of the era. Crichton Browne corresponded with Charles Darwin. He collaborated with the neurologist John Hewlings Jackson. He built essentially the beginnings of British neuroscience inside an asylum in the north of England. What they were looking for in the brains of patients who had died in the asylum was a lesion, a visible abnormality, proof that mental illness was at its root a physical disease of the brain, something that could be seen, measured, and eventually perhaps treated at its source. Some of what they found was genuinely significant. The pathological investigation of conditions like general paralysis of the insane, which we now know is caused by late-stage syphilis, eventually led to the identification of its bacterial cause, and later, its treatment. That is a real scientific achievement, and it should not be minimized. But for most mental illnesses, the lesion they were searching for was not there to be found. The brains of patients with mania or melancholia, or what we would now recognize as schizophrenia, did not show the clear, visible physical abnormalities the researchers were hoping for, and this created a crisis, a quiet, persistent, professionally uncomfortable crisis that ran through the Victorian asylum world for decades. If the physical basis of mental illness could not be found in the brain, did that mean mental illness was not a physical condition at all? Was psychiatry perhaps not really a branch of medicine? These questions were deeply threatening to a profession that had spent the better part of a century arguing that it deserved the same scientific respect as surgery or internal medicine, and different physicians answered them very differently. One of the most fascinating answers came from a man named John Charles Bucknell, who served as medical superintendent of the Devon County Lunatic Asylum from 1844, and who was in his spare time a serious student of Shakespeare. In 1859, Bucknell published a book called The Psychology of Shakespeare, in which he analysed the mental states of Shakespearean characters using the diagnostic frameworks of Victorian psychiatry. Hamlet in Bucknell's reading displayed clear signs of melancholia with intermittent excitements. Lady Macbeth exhibited what Bucknell classified as a form of somnambulistic insanity. King Lear's decline was mapped onto the trajectory of senile dementia. The book was taken seriously by both the literary and the medical establishments. I find Bucknell's project endearing, honestly. Here was a Victorian asylum doctor sitting in his office surrounded by case files of real patients, picking up his Shakespeare and thinking the bard got it right. The inner experience of mental illness that I see every day in these wards, someone understood it 400 years ago and put it on a stage. There is something both humble and poignant about that recognition. He was looking for understanding in literature because the science of his era could not yet provide it. And perhaps that is the most honest summary of the Victorian alienist situation. They were working at the edge of human knowledge in an area where the tools of scientific inquiry had not yet caught up with the complexity of what they were trying to understand. Some responded to that uncertainty with overconfidence, with theories that exceeded their evidence, and interventions that exceeded their justification. Some responded with genuine humility, with careful observation, and tentative conclusions, and a willingness to admit what they did not know. The ones who responded with humility tended to do less harm. They also tended to leave fewer traces in the historical record because humility does not generate the kind of bold claims that get published and cited and remembered. There is again probably a lesson in that. And speaking of the people who made the boldest moves, who charged into the Victorian Asylum story with a notebook, a fury and a refusal to look away, we have arrived at one of the most extraordinary chapters in this entire narrative, the story of a young woman who pretended to lose her mind in order to expose what was happening to the people who had actually lost theirs. Her name was Nelly Bly, and the 10 days she spent inside Blackwell's Island Asylum in New York in the autumn of 1887 changed American history. She is waiting for us in the next part of our story. Her real name was Elizabeth Jane Cochran. She was 23 years old, and on a morning in late September of 1887 she stood in front of a mirror in a boarding house in New York City and practiced going mad. She'd been hired by Joseph Pulitzer's New York World to investigate conditions inside Blackwell's Island Asylum, the public institution on a small island in the East River where the city sent its most desperate cases. The assignment was her idea. She had pitched it herself, and the method she proposed was by any measure audacious she would get herself committed. She would go in as a patient, live as a patient, observe everything she could, and then come out and write about it. The editor agreed with some nervousness. The lawyers were consulted. And Nelly Bly, the pen name she had already made famous, went home and began to prepare. What strikes me about this preparation every time I read about it is how methodical it was. She did not simply decide to act strangely and hope for the best. She researched. She spoke to physicians carefully and indirectly about the outward signs of mental disturbance considered diagnostic in the era. She practiced expressions in the mirror. She worked on the particular quality of a gaze that would be described in medical reports as vacant or disturbed. She was in a very real sense doing what an actor does before inhabiting a difficult role, except that the stage was a real institution. The audience was real medical professionals, and the consequences of being found out would have been genuinely serious. On the evening of September 22nd, 1887, she checked into the temporary home for females on 2nd Avenue in Manhattan, using a false name. She behaved strangely throughout the night, enough to alarm the other residents. By morning the police had been called. She was taken before a judge named Duffy at the Harlem Police Court, who observed her carefully, and then declared with the confident authority of someone who had no particular training in psychiatry that she was clearly insane. Several physicians confirmed the diagnosis. Each examination lasted, by Bly's later account, only a matter of minutes, and just like that, without trial, without any formal process, without anyone asking whether she had family who might speak for her, Elizabeth Jane Cochran was committed to Blackwell's Island Asylum. The machine that had processed thousands of women before her processed her too smoothly and without friction. What she found inside is documented in her book 10 Days in a Madhouse, published in 1887, and it remains one of the most gripping first-person accounts of institutional life ever written. Let me tell you some of what she saw. The food. Bly described the meals at Blackwell's Island with a specificity that makes them vivid even now. Rancid butter spread on bread so stale it had to be soaked in the watery tea before it could be chewed. Meat that was, in her words, more spoiled than fresh. Prunes served in a liquid she could not identify. The tea itself, and this detail stayed with me, was described as black and unrecognizable, bearing no resemblance to any tea she had encountered outside. When she asked an attendant about the quality of the food, she was told that the patients did not know the difference, that they could not taste properly, that it did not matter. It did matter, of course. It mattered enormously. But the people making that decision had decided in advance that the judgment of the patients was not reliable, and so the patient's obvious discomfort with the food was classified not as a legitimate response to genuinely bad food, but as further evidence of their disordered perception, the baths. Once a week, the patients were bathed in a process that Bly described with barely contained horror. Patients were lined up and immersed one after another in the same tub of water. The water was not changed between patients. By the time the last woman in the line reached the tub, the water was, by Bly's description, grey and cold. Attendants scrubbed patients roughly with no apparent attention to individual comfort or dignity. Women who protested were handled more roughly still, and the cold. The wards at Blackwell's Island were in the autumn of 1887 inadequately heated. Bly and the other patients sat for hours on hard wooden benches in thin institutional clothing, in temperatures she described as genuinely painful. When she asked for warmer clothing, she was refused. When she shivered visibly enough that an attendant noticed, the attendant's response was to tell her to stop. Just stop being cold, as if the cold were a choice. Now I want to pause here and ask you something. If you were placed in that environment, cold, hungry, wearing thin clothing on a hard bench surrounded by people in distress, with no clear sense of when or whether you would leave, how long do you think it would take before your behaviour began to seem to an outside observer genuinely disordered? Bly asked herself exactly that question during her 10 days, and her answer was not very long. She wrote about watching women who had arrived at the institution relatively composed become increasingly disturbed as the weeks and months wore on. Not because their underlying mental state had worsened necessarily, but because the conditions of the institution were themselves destabilizing. The deprivation, the monotony, the absence of stimulation, the constant proximity to suffering, these things had effects on the mind. They had effects on Bly's mind, and she was only there for 10 days and knew she was leaving. She was released on October 4th, 1887 by arrangement with the New York World. Her series of articles ran immediately after, and the public response was extraordinary. The grand jury that convened to investigate her findings agreed with her account. Abusive attendants were dismissed. The city increased the asylum's budget by approximately $1 million in today's equivalent funding that went toward better food, warmer buildings, more staff, and crucially translators to assist patients who did not speak English. Real, concrete, measurable improvements traceable directly to 10 days of undercover observation by a 23-year-old journalist. But I want to complicate the Nelly Bly story a little, because I think she deserves to be understood fully rather than simply celebrated. Nelly Bly was able to do what she did because she had something most of the women inside Blackwell's Island did not have: a powerful employer, a public platform, and the absolute certainty that someone on the outside was going to come and get her. She was performing powerlessness from a position of considerable structural privilege. When her 10 days were up, she walked out. The women she'd lived alongside, the immigrants who could not explain themselves, the poor women who had no advocates, the women whose families had signed the papers and then stopped visiting, they stayed. This does not diminish what Bly accomplished. The improvements she helped bring about were real, and real people benefited from them. But it does raise a question worth sitting with: who gets to be the hero of a story about institutional injustice? Almost always the answer is someone who can leave. The people who cannot leave rarely get to tell their own story. Bly was not the only woman fighting this particular battle, and she was not the first. About 25 years before Bly's undercover assignment, a woman named Elizabeth Packard had been committed to the Jacksonville State Hospital in Illinois by her husband, a minister named Theophilus Packard, because she had publicly disagreed with his theological views in their church. In 1860, a married woman in Illinois had no legal right to refuse commitment if her husband requested it. No trial was required. No independent medical opinion was necessary. Theophilus Packard signed a paper, and Elizabeth Packard disappeared into the institution for 3 years. When she was finally released, partly through the efforts of sympathetic staff who recognized that she was entirely lucid, she did not go home and recover quietly. She went to the Illinois state legislature and she fought. She campaigned for what she called the personal liberty laws, which would require that any person facing commitment have the right to a public trial before a jury. She wrote books about her experience. She traveled and lectured. The personal liberty laws she championed eventually passed in Illinois and influenced legislation in several other states. The right of a committed person to legal representation, to a hearing, to some form of due process, these protections, which we now take for granted, were not always there. Elizabeth Packard helped put them there. What strikes me about both Bly and Packard is the particular kind of courage they embodied. Not the dramatic battlefield kind. The grinding, sustained, often lonely kind. The courage of deciding that what happened to you is not just your private tragedy, but a public problem that requires a public solution. That your experience gives you not just the right, but the obligation to speak. There were, of course, thousands of women in Victorian asylums who had exactly that kind of courage and no platform from which to exercise it. Women who knew with complete clarity that what was happening to them was wrong, and who had no newspaper behind them, no legislature willing to hear them, no record of their protests surviving beyond a note in a case file. Their courage was real too, even if history preserved almost none of it. The story of women in the Victorian asylum is ultimately the story of what happens when an institution is built by people who hold certain assumptions about whose experience matters, whose judgment can be trusted, whose voice deserves to be heard. And it is also the story of what happens when individuals, even a few with the right combination of courage and circumstance, push back against those assumptions hard enough that the institution has to change. The change was slow. The change was incomplete. The change came too late for most of the women whose stories we will never know. But it came, and the forces of decline and decay that were already accumulating in the Victorian asylum system by the time Nelly Bly walked out of Blackwell's Island, the overcrowding, the understaffing, the creeping erosion of the idealism that had built these institutions in the first place, those forces were building towards something. A tipping point, a moment when the gap between what the asylum claimed to be and what it actually was became too wide to ignore. That collapse and what it looked like from the inside as it happened is exactly where we're headed next. Sometime in the 1890s, someone at the Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in North London made a decision that tells you everything about what had happened to the Victorian asylum system by the end of the century. They converted a corridor into a ward. Not a proper ward, not a space designed and built for the purpose of housing human beings in any degree of comfort or dignity. A corridor, a passageway. They put beds in it. They put patients in the beds, and they counted those patients in the official census of the institution as having been properly housed. The beds were so close together that the patients could not get out of them on both sides. They had to climb over one another to reach the door. Colney Hatch had opened in 1851 as one of the largest and most modern asylums in Britain. It was designed to house just over 1,000 patients, which at the time of its opening seemed almost extravagantly large. The building was a masterpiece of Victorian institutional architecture, a main corridor nearly 1/3 of a mile long running the length of the complex with wards branching off on either side. Gas lighting, a ventilation system, a farm, a chapel, a recreation hall. It was built to be the future of mental health care. By 1900 it held more than 2,500 patients. The farm could not feed them. The staff could not know them. The corridors that had been designed for circulation became storage for human beings who had somewhere in the machinery of the institution ceased to be individuals and become a number on a census form. This is the story of what happened to the Victorian asylum dream when the century that had created it finally ran out of road. The numbers tell part of the story, and they're worth sitting with for a moment. In the 1850s, the average Victorian asylum housed somewhere between 200 and 500 patients. The ratio of attendance to patients hovered in the better institutions around 1 to 6 or 1 to 8, not generous by any standard, but manageable enough for attendants who genuinely cared to learn the names and histories of the people in their charge. By the 1890s, those numbers had transformed almost beyond recognition. The average asylum population had roughly quadrupled. The attendant-to-patient ratio in most public institutions had stretched to 1 to 31 to 40, sometimes beyond. The commissioners in lunacy were producing annual reports that read by the late 1890s more like lists of inadequacies than assessments of care. One report from 1897 noted across multiple institutions dangerous levels of overcrowding, insufficient staffing, and what the commissioners described with characteristic Victorian understatement as a general decline in the standard of patient attention. A general decline in the standard of patient attention. What that phrase covered, if you follow the individual cases behind it, includes things like patients left in their own waste for extended periods because there were not enough attendants to manage the basic hygiene of everyone in the ward. It includes patients who had been admitted in genuine crisis and who years later were still in the same institution, not because they needed to be there, but because the system had never got around to assessing whether they had recovered. It includes the emergence of what staff in many institutions has begun to call among themselves the back wards. The back wards. That phrase deserves its own moment of attention. In the geography of the Victorian asylum, the back wards were the places furthest from the entrance, furthest from the administrative offices, furthest from the eyes of visitors and inspectors. They housed the patients who were considered formally or informally to be chronically ill incurable, beyond the reach of whatever treatments the institution was currently employing. In the language of the era, these were the patients who were simply waiting for what was rarely specified, because the honest answer, waiting to die, was not something that fit comfortably into the official vocabulary of an institution that still in its annual reports and its public-facing documents described itself as a place of care and treatment. One of the most disturbing official investigations of this period was a series of inspections conducted at Leavesden Asylum in Hertfordshire in the 1870s and 1880s. Leavesden had been opened specifically to house patients considered permanently and profoundly mentally disabled, for whom active treatment was not anticipated. The intention had been to provide them with a safe, humane environment where their basic needs would be met. What the inspectors found over multiple visits was something considerably bleaker. Patients who had been in the institution for decades and who had received in all that time no meaningful assessment of whether their condition had changed. Patients classified on admission who had in the intervening years developed the capacity for speech, for work, for social interaction, but who had never been reassessed because the system that had labelled them on admission had no mechanism for revising that label. They had been filed away, and filing systems once organised tend to resist reorganisation. I find the Leavesden cases among the most quietly heartbreaking in the entire asylum record. Not because of dramatic cruelty, the staff at Leavesden were not by most accounts deliberately unkind, but because of the particular tragedy of being unseen, of having recovered or partially recovered or developed in ways that no one expected, and having that development simply not register because the institution had already decided what you were and had structured its entire operation around that decision. Now, I want to ask you something that I genuinely think about when I encounter these stories. At what point does an institution that was built to help people become an institution that is primarily serving its own continuation? At what point do the buildings and the budgets and the professional identities of the staff and the administrative structures become more real, more solid, more defended than the needs of the people the whole enterprise was supposed to be for? I do not think there is a clean answer to that question. I do not think there is a single moment you can point to and say, there, that is where it tipped. It is a gradual thing. A series of small accommodations, each individually reasonable, that accumulate over years into something that the people who made the original accommodations would not recognize. What I do think is that by the final decade of the 19th century, most of the large Victorian public asylums had crossed that line. The institution had become primary, the patient had become secondary, and the language of medicine and care continued to be used because no one had yet developed an adequate language for describing what these places had actually become. One of the most significant attempts to name what was happening came from an unexpected direction. In 1879, an organisation called the Mental Aftercare Association was founded in England, one of the first organisations specifically dedicated to helping patients transition out of asylums and back into the community. Its founders had noticed something that the official statistics consistently underplayed, that a significant proportion of patients who were discharged from asylums did not stay discharged. They went home, found that the world they had left had not waited for them, found that they had no work and no support and no framework for managing outside the institution, and ended up being readmitted. The revolving door, we would call it now. The 1870s had already invented it, even if they did not have that name. The Mental Aftercare Association tried to provide the practical support that the asylums themselves could not help finding employment temporary accommodation for patients who had nowhere to go, social networks for people who'd been isolated by years of institutional life. Its work was modest in scale. It could only reach a fraction of the people who needed it, but its existence acknowledged something important, that getting out of the asylum was only the beginning of the problem. Meanwhile, a new and troubling current of thought was beginning to shape how the asylum population was understood. In 1883, a scientist named Francis Galton published a book called Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development, in which he coined a word that would cast a long and dark shadow over the 20th century: eugenics. Galton was not primarily interested in asylums. He was interested in heredity, in whether intelligence and character were inherited, and whether through selective reproduction the human population might be improved over time. But his ideas intersected with the asylum world in an uncomfortable way, because the asylum population was already being described in much of the medical literature of the era in terms of hereditary transmission. The family histories of patients were recorded with increasing attention to patterns across generations. What this meant in practice was that the asylum began to be seen not just as a place of care, but as a place of containment, a way of removing certain individuals from the reproductive pool. This idea was not in the 1880s explicitly policy. It was a current of thought, a set of assumptions that shaped how patients were described and discussed without ever being openly stated as a governing principle. But currents of thought have a way of becoming policy over time, and the eugenics movement that Galton's work helped launch would in the early 20th century produce consequences that the Victorian asylum builders, most of whom were, as we have seen, genuine humanitarians, would have found appalling. History has a way of doing that, of taking the structures and systems built by idealists and handing them to successors whose idealism has curdled into something unrecognisable. The Victorian asylum was built on hope, It was transformed over 5 decades into something that preserved the form of that hope, the buildings, the administrative structures, the official vocabulary of care and treatment, while the substance quietly drained away. By 1900, the question was no longer whether the system was working. It clearly was not, and almost everyone who engaged with it honestly knew it. The question was what came next, and the answer to that question would take another 60 years to fully arrive, and when it did, it would create a whole new set of problems that we are still living with today. But before we get there, before we look at what happened, when the century finally ran out and the institutions began to empty, I want to take you somewhere more intimate. Because throughout this entire story, running alongside the official records and the parliamentary reports and the physicians' case notes, there have been other voices, quieter voices, the voices of the people who actually lived inside these institutions and who, against considerable odds, found ways to leave a record of what that experience felt like from the inside. Some of them wrote letters, some kept diaries, some produced art, some dictated their accounts to sympathetic listeners who wrote them down. Their words have been waiting in archives and special collections across Britain and America for someone to sit down and read them, and that is exactly what we're going to do next. In 1838, a man sat down in his room and began to write. Not a medical report, not an official document, a memoir, a first-person account written in careful and articulate English of what it had felt like to be inside a Victorian asylum as a patient. His name was John Thomas Percival. He was 30 years old. He was the son of Spencer Percival, the only British Prime Minister ever to have been assassinated, shot in the lobby of the House of Commons in 1812. John had grown up in the shadow of that event in a large and complicated family, and in his late 20s he had experienced what his era called a severe attack of insanity. Episodes of hearing voices of elaborate religious delusions of behaviour that frightened the people around him. He had been committed, first to a private asylum in Bristol run by a Dr. Fox, then to Brislington House in Somerset, 3 years in total across 2 institutions, and when he came out he wrote it all down. What Percival produced, published in 2 volumes in 1838 and 1840, is one of the most remarkable documents in the entire history of psychiatry. Not because it is dramatic, although parts of it are, not because it is sensational, although the conditions it describes were often genuinely shocking, but because it is precise, careful, thoughtful. Percival was not interested in simply denouncing the people who had treated him. He was interested in understanding the experience, in mapping as accurately as he could the interior landscape of a mind in crisis, and the exterior landscape of an institution that had no idea what to do with him. He wrote about the voices he heard during his illness not as embarrassments to be glossed over, but as phenomena worth describing in detail. He tried to communicate what it was like to experience thoughts that did not feel like his own instructions, that arrived without his consent, a sense of being inhabited by something that was both himself and not himself. Victorian medicine had no language adequate to this experience. Percival had to invent his own. He also wrote about the asylum itself, about being restrained when he did not understand why, about being given food he could not eat and told to eat it anyway, about the particular madness as he saw it, of an institution that responded to distress by adding more distress that met his confusion with coercion, his terror with force, his need for explanation with silence. He was not angry, or not only angry, he was analytical. He wanted to understand the logic of the institution even when its logic seemed to him profoundly wrong. After his release, Percival became one of the founders of something called the Alleged Lunatics Friend Society, an organisation established in 1845 to advocate for the rights of people who had been committed to asylums to investigate complaints of mistreatment and to challenge wrongful commitments through legal means. The name alone tells you something about the political climate in which it operated. Not the Lunatics' Friend Society, the alleged Lunatics' Friend Society, because even the act of questioning a diagnosis was in that era enough to have your sanity questioned in return. The society operated for about 2 decades before its energy faded. It helped some people, it was ignored more often than it was heard, but its existence is significant. Percival understood something that the medical establishment did not want to acknowledge, that the experience of the patient was a form of knowledge, that what it felt like to be inside these institutions was data, and that ignoring it was not just unkind but scientifically wrong. Now let me tell you about a painting, because one of the strangest and most beautiful things about the Victorian Asylum is the art that came out of it. Richard Dadd was a painter genuinely talented, trained at the Royal Academy in London, considered by his peers to be one of the most promising artists of his generation. In 1843, at the age of 26, he killed his father in a field in Kent. He was suffering from what we would now recognise as severe psychosis, a condition that had developed rapidly during a tour of the Middle East the previous year, and that had gone unrecognised and untreated until it produced a tragedy. Dadd was committed to Bethlem, and there in the asylum Richard Dadd painted. He painted for years, decades. His most famous work, a painting called The Fairy Fella's Masterstroke, was begun in 1855 and worked on continuously for 9 years before Dadd considered it finished, or as close to finished as it would ever be. It is a small canvas, only about 20 by 15 inches, densely packed with tiny figures from folklore and fairy tradition, rendered in extraordinary detail, individual blades of grass, individual hairs on individual heads, a level of miniaturous precision that required a remarkable degree of sustained concentration and technical skill. This painting was made inside a Victorian asylum by a man who had committed a terrible act during an episode of severe mental illness, who had then spent decades in an institution, who had no access to an art supply shop or a gallery, or any of the normal infrastructure of an artistic career. He had paintbrushes, canvas, and time, and out of those materials inside those walls he produced something that now hangs in the Tate Britain in London, and is considered one of the masterpieces of Victorian art. I find Dadd's story genuinely moving, and I also find it genuinely complicated. His talent did not disappear when he became ill. His illness did not erase his gifts, his intelligence, his aesthetic sensibility, his capacity for sustained creative work. The asylum contained him literally physically, but it could not contain what he was capable of. The painting got out even if he did not. Not everyone had paint and canvas, but many patients had something, a pencil, a scrap of paper, the margin of a letter that had been read and set aside. The archives of the Victorian asylums contained fragments of written expression that were never intended to be historical documents, shopping lists for things the writer would never be allowed to buy, letters to family members who did not write back attempts at poetry and handwriting that shook with either illness or age or cold. One of the most affecting collections of this kind comes from the archives of Bethlem itself, the Museum of the Mind, which now occupies the modern Bethlem Royal Hospital site, and holds an extraordinary trove of patient-created materials spanning several centuries. Among them are drawings made by patients in the 19th century, not self-conscious artwork in the way Dadd's was, but instinctive mark-making. Faces, animals, patterns repeated obsessively across a page, attempts to capture something, an emotion, a memory, an inner state for which the maker had no other language. Looking at these materials is a strange experience. You are looking at communication across a very long distance, across more than 100 years, across the boundary between illness and health, across the enormous gulf between that world and this one. And what strikes you every time is how familiar the impulse is. The need to make a mark, to say I was here, I experienced this. I am more than what the institution's records say I am. Now, I want to tell you about one more voice, one that came slightly later than the Victorian era, but that speaks with unusual clarity about the experience we've been tracing through this entire story. Clifford Beers was an American, a graduate of Yale University, who in 1900 suffered a severe mental breakdown and spent the next 3 years moving through a series of Connecticut institutions, public and private. He experienced conditions ranging from the relatively humane to the genuinely brutal. He was restrained. He was isolated. He was on at least one occasion physically mistreated by an attendant. When he recovered and was released, he did what Percival had done 60 years earlier. He wrote it down. His book, published in 1908 and titled A Mind That Found Itself, was an immediate sensation. It was read by William James, the philosopher and psychologist who wrote to Beers praising it. It was read by psychiatrists and reformers and ordinary people who recognized in Beers's account something they had either experienced themselves or witnessed in someone they loved. But Beers did not stop at writing. He used the attention the book generated to found the Connecticut Society for Mental Hygiene in 1908, which became the template for the modern mental health advocacy organization. He understood, as Percival had understood, as Elizabeth Packard had understood, that individual testimony, however powerful, was not enough, that the system could absorb individual stories without changing. What was needed was an organized, sustained, publicly visible campaign for reform. What I find most striking about the line that runs from Percival to Beers, from 1838 to 1908, from the early Victorian era to the beginning of the modern one, is how consistent the core complaint is. Not the specific abuses which varied by institution and era, but the structural problem beneath them, that the person inside the institution was systematically denied the status of a reliable witness to their own experience. Their testimony was by definition suspect. Their judgment was by the very act of being committed considered impaired, and so the institution could do almost anything to them and describe it as treatment, and there was no authoritative voice available to say, that is not what it felt like from the inside. Percival had that voice, Dad had his paint, Beers had his pen and his organisational energy, and thousands of others had nothing but a pencil stub and a scrap of paper and the stubborn human conviction that their experience was real and worth recording. Some of what they created survived, most of it did not, and the parts that survived have spent a long time waiting to be taken seriously. We are, I think, still in the process of learning to take them seriously, which is one of the reasons stories like this one matter. The physical places where these lives were lived, the buildings themselves, are still out there. Some of them converted, some demolished, some standing empty on their hills with their windows dark and their grounds overgrown. What those buildings look like now, what became of them, and what it means that we preserved some of them and let others decay, that is the story that is waiting for us next. Drive through the right parts of upstate New York on a grey afternoon, and you will see it before you understand what you're looking at. A building, or rather a complex of buildings, towers and wings and connecting corridors, spreading across a hillside built from a warm reddish sandstone that catches the last of the afternoon light and glows briefly before the cloud comes back. The windows are dark. Some of them are broken. The grounds around the building have gone back to something between garden and wilderness. Old trees, untended paths, the ghost of a formal layout still faintly visible beneath the overgrowth. This is the Buffalo State Asylum for the Insane, completed in 1880, designed by the architect Henry Hobson Richardson, in collaboration with the landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who also designed Central Park in New York City. Together they produced what many architectural historians consider one of the finest examples of institutional design in American history. Two magnificent towers, a facade of extraordinary dignity, grounds meant to be therapeutic in themselves, rolling naturalistic, carefully planned to give patients the sense of space and openness that the reformers believed was essential to recovery. For most of the 20th century, the building sat deteriorating on its hill. The patients were gone. The staff were gone. By the early 2000s, significant portions of the complex were structurally compromised and considered dangerous. It would have been cheaper to demolish it than to save it, but it was not demolished. After years of advocacy, the building became the Richardson-Olmsted campus, a mixed-use development that now houses a hotel, event spaces and arts facilities. The towers that once looked out over wards of suffering human beings now look out over wedding receptions and architecture tours. I do not know exactly how to feel about that, and I think that uncertainty is the appropriate response. Because here is the question that the surviving asylum buildings force us to ask: what do we owe to places where terrible things happened? Does preserving a building honor the people who lived inside it, or does it erase their experience by converting their prison into a luxury hotel? Does demolishing it respect their memory, or does it simply allow us to forget that any of this ever happened? There is no consensus answer. Different communities dealing with different asylum buildings in different circumstances have come to very different conclusions. The Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey, a magnificent Kirkbride plan building completed in 1876, which once housed more than 7,000 patients at its peak of overcrowding, was demolished in 2015 despite years of preservation campaigns. The cost of restoration was prohibitive, the land was needed for other purposes, and some local voices argued that preserving the building preserved the stigma associated with it. Let it go, they said. Let the land be something new. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in western West Virginia, the same institution whose admission records listed book reading as a cause of insanity, is still standing, and it has found a different kind of afterlife. It offers ghost tours. Visitors pay to walk through the wards at night, guided by people who describe the building's history in terms of supernatural activity. Whatever you think about that particular approach to preservation, the building survives, and the history survives with it, including the uncomfortable parts. In England, many of the great Victorian asylum buildings have been converted into residential developments, luxury apartments marketed with the original building's features preserved as selling points: the ornate cornices, the chapel with its stained glass, the long corridors now divided into hallways serving private flats. The Severals Hospital in Essex, which opened in 1913 and finally closed in 1997, became, after years of haunting abandonment, a residential conversion called Severals Park. The wards where patients once lived are now living rooms. Is this preservation or appropriation? Is it memory or erasure? I genuinely do not know. What I do know is that these buildings matter, that they are physical evidence of a chapter of history that shaped how we understand the human mind, how we treat human suffering, and what we are willing to do to people who do not fit the categories we have created. Letting them disappear entirely would be its own form of forgetting. And speaking of forgetting, we have arrived at the final chapter of our story, and in some ways it is the most important one. Because the Victorian Asylum did not simply end. It did not fade gently away and leave a vacuum that was neatly filled with something better. It collapsed over several decades of the 20th century, in a process that was both necessary and chaotic, both liberating and catastrophic. And the consequences of that collapse are still being felt today in ways that most people do not recognize as connected to a story that began in the 1800s. The formal turning point is often dated to a speech delivered by the British Minister of Health, Enoch Powell, in March of 1961. Powell stood before the National Association for Mental Health and delivered what became known as the Water Tower speech, named for his description of the old asylum buildings as water towers and chimney stacks that were looming up through the mist. He announced that the government intended to reduce the number of psychiatric beds in Britain by half within 15 years, and to eventually close most of the large psychiatric hospitals entirely. The philosophy behind this announcement was called Deinstitutionalization. The argument in its essentials was the same argument that the reformers of the 1830s had made about the old madhouses, that large institutions were inherently dehumanizing, that people with mental illness were better served in their communities than in segregated custodial facilities, and that the old asylum system had failed the people it was supposed to help. In the United States, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act in 1963, which aimed to establish a nationwide network of community mental health centers as alternatives to the large state hospitals. The intention was that as the hospitals emptied, the community centers would fill, providing outpatient treatment, crisis services, supported housing, and the social infrastructure that patients needed to live outside institutions. The hospitals emptied. The community centers in most places did not fully materialize. Funding fell short. Political will wavered. The patients who had lived for years or decades inside institutions emerged into communities that had not been prepared to receive them, communities that lacked the services, the housing, the social support networks, and frankly, the tolerance necessary to make deinstitutionalization work the way its architects had intended. What happened next is one of the great quiet catastrophes of 20th century social policy. A significant proportion of the people discharged from psychiatric hospitals during the deinstitutionalization era ended up in circumstances that were in some respects worse than the institutions they had left. Homeless, in jails and prisons because the criminal justice system became by default the institution of a last resort for people experiencing severe mental illness who had nowhere else to go. By the 1980s and 1990s, researchers and advocates were pointing out with increasing alarm that the prison population in the United States included a dramatically disproportionate number of people with serious mental illnesses. Studies conducted in the 2000s and 2010s have consistently found that somewhere between 15 and 20% of the United States prison population has a serious mental illness, a rate several times higher than in the general population. The jails and prisons had become in effect the largest psychiatric institutions in the country, not because anyone intended that outcome, but because the community infrastructure that was supposed to replace the asylums was never adequately funded or built. The water towers and chimney stacks that Enoch Powell wanted to pull down were replaced not with community care but with something considerably more punitive and considerably less therapeutic. I want to be careful here because this is a complicated picture. Deinstitutionalization was not simply a mistake. For many people with mental illness, the end of the institutional era was genuinely liberating a chance to live in the community, to have relationships, to exercise autonomy, to be seen as something other than a patient. The civil rights of people with mental illness were better protected outside the institutions than inside them. The worst abuses of the asylum era became over time harder to perpetrate, but the best intentions of deinstitutionalization encountered the same obstacle that had destroyed the best intentions of the original asylum builders: inadequate resources, inadequate follow-through, and the persistent human tendency to solve visible problems in ways that create invisible ones. The Victorian asylum was built to replace something terrible, and became over time terrible in its own way. The community care model was built to replace the asylums, and became over time a different kind of failure. And the question that hangs over both experiments, the question we've been circling throughout this entire story, is still not answered. How do we care as a society for the people among us who are suffering in ways they cannot manage alone? How do we provide genuine help without creating systems of control that do harm in the name of care? How do we build institutions because some institutions are necessary, the need does not go away, simply because the buildings are torn down that serve the people inside them, rather than using those people to serve the institution? I do not have the answer to those questions. Neither does anyone else entirely. But I think the history we have explored together has something to offer, the search for answers, not because the past tells us what to do, but because it shows us with uncomfortable clarity the patterns we keep repeating and the mistakes we keep making under different names. The reformers of the 1830s believed they had found the solution. The architects of deinstitutionalization believed they had found the solution. In both cases, the solution was real and partial and insufficient and eventually overtaken by consequences that no one had fully anticipated. Which is not an argument for despair, it is an argument for humility, for building systems that acknowledge their own limitations, for staying curious about the experience of the people inside the institutions rather than assuming that good intentions are enough. We started this journey in the darkness that existed before the asylum walls went up in the cellars and the madhouses and the back rooms, where people in distress were hidden away from a world that did not know what to do with them. We walked through Bethlem and Hanwell and Blackwell's Island. We sat with the reformers who built something beautiful and watched it become something they would not have recognized. We read the letters and looked at the paintings of people who refused against considerable odds to be entirely erased. And what I am left with at the end of all of it is not the horror, though the horror was real. It is not the failure, though the failures were significant and their consequences are still with us. What I am left with is something more like wonder at the stubbornness of the human impulse toward dignity, the way it keeps reappearing generation after generation in people who had every reason to give up on it. William Tuke refusing to accept that his fellow human beings deserved to be chained. John Percival sitting down to write a book that almost no one would read for 100 years. Richard Dadd painting fairies on a tiny canvas in a locked ward year after year until the painting was finished. Elizabeth Packard walking out of the asylum and straight into the state legislature. Nelly Bly standing in front of a mirror practicing going mad so that she could tell the world what mad people were being subjected to. None of them fixed the problem. All of them made it a little less bad, and a little less bad multiplied across enough people and enough generations is how the world changes. That feels worth remembering. Thank you genuinely from the bottom of my heart for spending this time with me tonight. Travelling through almost 800 years of history is not a small thing to ask of someone who came here looking for a bedtime story, and I am deeply grateful that you stayed. If this kind of history, honest, uncomfortable, human, is the kind of thing that keeps you coming back, please do subscribe if you have not already, and leave a comment below telling me what part of this story stayed with you the longest. Was it the image of patients decorating their cells with tiny gardens, the spinning chair, Nelly Bly practicing her vacant stare in a boarding house mirror, Richard Dadd's painting made across 9 years in a locked room? Something else entirely. I read every single comment and I mean that. And if you know someone who thinks history is dry or distant or irrelevant to their life, share this with them. Because the story we told tonight is not the past. It is an X-ray of the present taken from a different angle. The next story I have for you travels somewhere entirely different, a different era, a different country, a different kind of human drama that I think you are going to find just as strange and just as moving as this one. I cannot wait to take you there. Until then, rest well, sleep gently, and know that the most radical thing you can do in a world that has always struggled to care for its most vulnerable people is to keep paying attention.